Hi, everyone. Freddie Kiger welcoming you back to part two of one of our own, Thomas Wolfe. And when we left off from part one, World War I had ended, to the great disappointment of Thomas Wolfe and many of his mates, thinking that war was glorious and magnificent, and that it offered 1,000 chances for glory, adventure, and joy. And so, in the January following the end of the war, he and 6 others moved to a new location on Fraternity Row. They settled in on January the 7th, but 2 hours after midnight, a fire gutted not only their Pi Kappa Phi house, but the Sigma Nu and Sigma Alpha Epsilon house, where the fire originally began. Wolfe and his mates, lucky to be alive, returned to their old chapter house back on Franklin Street. Now, despite all these disturbing events, Wolfe's personality rose above it all. As a classmate remembered, if you saw a little knot on the campus and went up there and heard a bunch of boys laughing, and you go up there, push into the middle, Tom would be in the middle, telling some big lie or laughing. And yet, beyond and beneath it all, some of the more perceptive friends sensed an undercurrent of doubt, of anxiety, of loneliness. But if so, Thomas Wolfe hit it well. Eccentric, in part because he chose to be, he might meet with others, then in the middle of conversation, shout one of his favorite phrases, Eureka, and then dash off to do something. Indeed, within this pocket-sized universe here in Chapel Hill, Thomas Wolfe was a bundle of energy. By 12:45, after morning classes, he'd be at Swain Hall having lunch and probably dodging thrown biscuits. Then off to the library or over at Emerson Field in the afternoon. He'd make time to grab a bite for supper, then to Bynum Gymnasium and the dance floor, then off to the student mayhem that reigned in Pickwick Theater on Franklin Street, or maybe over to the Y for a meeting. And, oh yes, then late at night, the bull sessions, the smokers. He was absolutely in his element. When he was confronted with a writing deadline, he'd go to an unheated room on the second floor of the Y building. And there, in his hideaway, he would compose. And despite all that he had taken on or joined, he added more. He became a member of the Satyrs, which was a collection of those who demonstrated distinguished dramatic ability. Among the faculty members of this elective society were Frederick Koch, who founded Carolina Playmakers, and 2 of Wolfe's favorite professors, Bully Bernard and Edwin Greenlaw. Among future Carolina notables in his public speaking honorary group were Albert Coates, future founder of the Institute of Government, and future historian Clement Eaton, who would specialize in the study of the American South. Indeed, the 1919 YAC was filled with organizations of which Wolfe was a member. The Buncombe County Club, he in the following images highlighted in blue, the Literary Society Sigma Upsilon. As we mentioned earlier, a featured debater for the Die Society, a contributing member of the University Magazine Board and managing editor of the Tar Heel. And while a tour de force, he began to write plays. In March of 1919, he starred in his own North Carolina folk story, The Return of Buck Gavin. And if all that wasn't enough, late in the academic year, it was announced he had been named to the Golden Fleece, which was the university's highest honor. And yet, all that energy could sometimes be tough to deal with. Truth be told, back at his fraternity, Few could put up with him. It wasn't that he was disliked, but his personal habits tested the patience of all. His mind raced. He was always thinking of the next task, so much so that he would forget to take baths or wash his clothes. Someone would have to remind him. The joke was that Wolfe belonged to every club on campus except the pressing club. No question, during that junior year where he truly flowered, one of his most influential professors was Prof. Koch, Frederick Henry Koch. The native of Kentucky, he was reared in Illinois, educated at Ohio Wesleyan and Harvard, arrived in 1918 and inspired Wolfe's writing of folk plays. Not only was Wolfe caught up in his magic, so was another individual by the name of Paul Green. It was Koch who founded, as we mentioned, Carolina Playmakers, and personally for Wolfe, the fervent desire to tell a story. He wrote, as we have noted, a Western North Carolina folk story, The Return of Buck Gavin, but how he came about acting in it is worth a quick aside. At tryouts, no one emerged to play the lead. Koch told the young playwright, "I guess you'll have to play it yourself, Tom. You may not know it, but you really wrote that part for yourself." When Wolfe declined, Koch added, "You're a born actor, and you are Buck Gavin." On the night of March 14th, and in the auditorium of Chapel Hill High School, 18-year-old Wolfe made his acting debut. Then in December of his senior year, Wolfe appeared in a second play that again he wrote, entitled The Third Night. It was a story about a degenerate Southern gentleman. Both productions were amateurish. Wolfe was so pleased with their local reception that he dreamed of the day when he could write plays with professional competence. And indeed, it was Koch who later urged him to study under the same man who unleashed his own passion, George Pierce Baker at Harvard. After what had been a most remarkable junior year, Wolfe spent a relatively uneventful summer in Asheville. His senior year began relatively late, in October of 1919. There were now some 1,350 students at the university, 95% of which were from North Carolina. The Department of English enrolled 608 students, Romance Languages 510, Chemistry 483, and on the other end of enrollment, there were 17 in Greek and 8 in rural economics. Of the 41 women on campus, 3 studied law, 3 medicine, and 1 pursued electrical engineering. For Wolfe's senior year, there was a new president, Harry Woodburn Chase. It was he who assembled the student body the 2nd of October in Girard Hall, where speeches were made. Among them, the dean of students, Frank Porter Graham, and Thomas Wolfe himself. He talked about campus publications and he invited participation. And no question, he was in his element. He was the editor of the Tar Heel, and most of his classes were taught by friends. Koch in advanced playwriting, Green Law in English Renaissance, and Horace Williams in logic. Wolfe also took some journalism classes. His professor for news editing and feature writing was a young professor of English who hailed from Wisconsin, C. Addison Hibbard, and Wolfe quickly indoctrinated him to his quirky style. On the way to Hibbard's class, Wolfe would pick handbills off telephone poles, then sit in the back of the classroom writing his assignments on them. Hibbard later remembered that once Wolfe entered his classroom to find the student eating a sandwich that he had taken from a paper bag and was writing his assignment in pencil on the empty bag. Wolfe carried his enthusiasm to his literary society's initiation as well, and carried it, quite honestly, a bit too far. Paul Green, back from World War I, wanted to join the literary fraternity Sigma Upsilon. For initiation, Wolfe wanted Greene, who was 6 years older, to lie all night between the pews of the Methodist Church. Well, Greene thought that pretty sophomoric and didn't go. Wolfe took offense, but gave the returning World War I veteran another chance. Wolfe told Greene to go to the road beside the town cemetery with a box of Nabisco vanilla wafers and run up and down repeating, Zuzu, Zuzu, I'm a little Zuzu. Greene decided to go through it, but as he did, Wolfe and several others jumped from behind tombstones with long paddles and began to pepper Greene with the blows. Greene remembered that in a low voice he asked not to be hit anymore. But that only seemed to ignite Wolfe's passion to hit him even harder. Greene later said, for a while, I hated Tom Wolfe. In far more positive light, Wolfe attended meetings of the Buncombe County Club, the YMCA Cabinet, the Athletic Council, and the Dye Society, where he, of course, held court. He wrote humorous and tongue-in-cheek stories in the campus humor magazine, the Carolina Tar Baby. He edited and wrote most of the copy for the Tar Heel. And in that role, he often made his way to Seaman Printery on Corcoran Street in Durham, where he competed for printing service with the Trinity College Chronicle, of course today, the Duke Chronicle. And like a good Tar Heel, Wolfe got his shots in. He would ask the printers to put aside the chronic ill, for it wasn't worth printing anyway. He delighted in writing about the UNC Virginia football game that Thanksgiving, which after a 2-year hiatus was played for the very first time in Chapel Hill. After the Carolina 6-0 win, Wolfe wrote that Virginia fought fiercely and died gamely. The win gave him cause to reprint Ye Who Have Been There Only Know, which, as you will remember, he had written as a freshman after traveling to Richmond for the game. That piece foreshadowed two themes in Wolfe's later writings: exuberance and nostalgia. In January, he changed rooms for the last time. He moved across Franklin Street to a ramshackle tree-shaded wooden structure that was named the University Inn. Though food was provided, he still entertained at his prescribed seat at the head of the table in Swain Hall. At UNC, his evolution had been quite remarkable. He came to Chapel Hill with many demons and doubts. He first suffered embarrassment and humiliation, but now, senior, he was truly a big man on campus. Yes, a BMOC, even though his clothes were ill-fit, even if he wore them for weeks on end, and even if his shoes squeaked, and even if he did not shave or get a haircut. And with his notoriety, he played upon it by not only being on the staff of both the Tar Heel and the magazine, he was the driving force behind their irreverent cousin, the satirically laden Tar Baby. Full of himself, the April 10th edition, all 44 pages of it, was filled with Thomas Wolfe. In it, he parodied the Raleigh News and Observer, which sounds like a good idea. Some of his entries included, in Greensboro, Mrs. Lem E. Hittem told police after shooting her husband, he drank his tea from a saucer, and I could not stand his tyranny no longer. Another, at a revival meeting by evangelist Hurricane McIntosh in Raleigh, 27 women fainted, 33 became hysterical and had to be carried off, and 17 strong members of the Pipe Fitters Union broke down and sobbed when the parson spoke of crooked joints. He even lampooned advertisements. In a testimonial for the patent medicine tan bark, Wolfe wrote that a Charlotte man stated, for some years I've had a fair-sized wart on the back of my neck, which I have been in the habit of using as a collar button. After taking 2 bottles of tan bark, I now hang my clothes on it. Even though his Carolina days were numbered, He maintained his whirlwind of activity. Quite honestly, there was not enough hours and minutes in the day. In this photo, which he, by the way, had taken, and by the way, taken with a pipe, because he believed men of genius smoked pipes, he seems to ooze with confidence and seemed full of life. And that self-assuredness led him to what he believed was his calling. In May of his senior year, he felt the stirrings of a desire to write. That desire had been stoked here in Chapel Hill. To him, this place was, as he put it, a kind of magic door, kind of magic key to the great material rewards of place and money. It was here the seed was planted. It was here it took root and blossomed. On Friday, May the 28th, Wolfe's senior class of 1920 held the first 4 meetings at Davy Poplar. Examinations were held through June the 11th. And that year, the Yakety-Yak, well, he was most prominent. With a long list of clubs and affiliations, he was named class poet. By his peers, he was voted best writer, most original, and wittiest. The senior page sang his praises. Still 19-year-old was called a young Shakespeare. And playing off his character as Buck Gavin, it was written that Buck is a great big fellow. He can do more between 8:25 and 8:30 than the rest of us can do all day. And it is no wonder that he is classed as a genius. For all he accomplished, proud parents journeyed from Asheville for his acclamation. His beloved mother and infirm father were there for the June 13th commencement. Wolfe wrote about his parents, the service, the day, through the eyes of Eugene Gant. From Look Homeward, Angel, the following passage. Gant and Eliza came to his graduation. He found them lodging in the town. It was early June, but green, fiercely and voluptuously southern. Campus was a green oven. The old grads went about in greasy pairs. The cool, pretty girls who never sweated came in to see their young men graduate and to dance. The mamas and papas were shown about dumbly and shyly. College was charming, half deserted. Most of the students, except the graduating class, had departed. The air was charged with the fresh, sensual heat, the deep green shimmer of heavy leafage, thousand spermy earth and flower scents. Young men, touched with sadness, with groping excitement, glory. At 5:30 that Sunday afternoon, under appropriately Davy's poplar, his mother and father listened to his reading of the class poem entitled 1920 Says a Few Words to Carolina. Thomas Wolfe looked ahead to the days when his class members would think again of this night here and of these old brown walls, of white old well and of old South, with bells' deep booming tune. They'll think again of Chapel Hill and thinking, come back home again. How ironic that last line, given one of his future works. Thomas Wolfe wrote to a friend, I hate to leave this place. It's mighty hard. It's the oldest state university, and there's an atmosphere here that's fine and good. After the ceremony, Wolfe looked after his parents, made sure all was well for them to get back to Asheville, but he wasn't ready to leave yet. There was some celebrating to do that night with some pure white whiskey. He had one more thing to do. He had one professor to visit, one who had helped mold him. Then would he be willing to tear himself from this place? Sure enough, the next day he made his way to a weather-beaten house on the then outskirts of town, seek out the man, the mentor who made him think, Horace Williams. Egotistical, eccentric, and sometimes quite contentious, maybe, just maybe, Wolfe saw in the professor's philosophy a little bit of himself. And Horace Williams, Thomas Wolfe found, as he put it, a madman with slakeless thirst. And look, homeward angel, Horace Williams was Virgil Weldon. And Wolfe described him in that novel, a small, wizened man with an enormous, bulbous head, thin, seamed face, and a closely cropped gray mustache. And in truth, indeed, he was. Tom had taken 3 classes in logic under him during his senior year, and that spurred several impromptu gatherings when the classroom was Williams' house, and Wolfe was the only student. About him, Thomas Wolfe wrote, one of the great spirits of the age unfolding quietly in a village. He had in him a touch of fire. And look, homeward angel, Wolfe waxed eloquent. Their last one-on-one under the ancient trees of his homestead, his last meeting, his farewell to Chapel Hill in Carolina. He wrote, the old man was charming, confidential, full of wise intimacy, gentle humor. They sat beneath the great trees of his yard and drank iced tea. Eugene was thinking of California, Peru, Asia, Alaska, Europe, Africa, China. But he, Weldon, mentioned Harvard. For him, it was not the name of the university. It was rich magic, wealth, elegance, joy, proud loneliness, rich books and golden browsing. It was an enchanted name like Cairo and Damascus. He felt somehow that it gave a reason, a goal of profit to his wild ecstasy. Yes, said Virgil Weldon approvingly, it's the place for you. The place for you, Mr. Grant. It doesn't matter about the others. They're ready now. But a mind like yours must not be pulled green. You must give it a chance to ripen. There you will find yourself. Eugene looked with passionate devotion at the grand old head, calm, wise, and comforting. And in a moment of vision, he saw that for him, it was the last of the heroes, the last of those giants to whom we give the faith of our youth, believing like children that the riddle of our lives may be solved by their quiet judgment. To me, you were always above good, above truth, above righteousness. Whatever you did was by its doing right. And now I leave you throned in memory. You will see my dark face burning on your bench no more. The memory of me will grow mixed and broken. You boys will come to win your favor and your praise. But you, forever fixed, unfading, bright, my lord. Eugene leaped suddenly to his feet and grasped the lean hand tightly in his own. I shall never forget you. Then turning, he plunged off blindly down the path. In September of 1920, Thomas Wolfe entered the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Harvard and studied for 3 years under George Pierce Baker, the same man who earlier filled the graduate student Frederick Koch with fire. At Harvard, no longer the gregarious student he was as an undergraduate in Chapel Hill, he fine-tuned his skill as a writer. The joy he felt completing his Master of Arts degree, however, was tempered by the news of his father's death. After burying his father, he returned to Harvard and wrote several plays. Teaching opportunities arose, and he taught 3 courses in English composition at Washington Square College, the downtown undergraduate college of NYU. But it frustrated him for the time he wanted to write was spent correcting papers, making up for what he believed Asheville and its encircling mountains had done to him, cut him off from the outside world. He made a trip to Europe. That experience only whetted his wanderlust. So there would be two more. After the third, he resumed teaching duties at NYU. On March the 31st, 1928, he completed a massive manuscript entitled "Oh Lost." Submitted to Charles Scribner's Sons, he made yet a fourth trip across the Atlantic. He was there while in Munich. He received a letter from Maxwell E. Perkins, legendary editor for Scribner's. Perkins asked him to return to New York to discuss "Oh Lost." Wolfe was ecstatic. After all, Perkins was the man who had discovered F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway. And yet, when they met January the 2nd, 1929, never had Perkins met anyone quite like Thomas Wolfe. The writer, all 28 years of age, was leaning against the door jamb in Perkins' office. And in Perkins' own words, I looked up and saw his wild hair and bright countenance. I thought of Shelley. Contract signed January the 9th. Together they began the Herculean task of editing 1,114 pages and over 330,000 words. Eventually, after 147 cuts and net reduction of 90,000 words, "Oh Lost" was published as "Look Homeward, Angel," the story of the buried life. It was a thinly disguised work of fiction. The novel was essentially an autobiographical novel, well, about Wolfe's coming of age. Within, there are more than 200 characters, and despite the changing of names for people and places, few were not fooled by Wolfe's literary camouflage. And that would not only displease, but enrage many in his hometown who caught the brunt of Wolfe's youthful frustrations, his angst and anger created by the isolation that he believed Asheville, Altamont of the novel, and its mountainous walls had created. Released October the 18th, 1929, reviewers were dazzled. Sinclair Lewis in Stockholm, to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature, told his audience that "Look Homeward, Angel" was, in Lewis's words, worthy to be compared with the best in our literary production, a gargantuan creature, a great gusto of life. Yet, as just mentioned, in Asheville, it was an exploding powder keg. Many there were shocked, embarrassed, humiliated. There, it was damned from street corner to pulpit, banned from the public library, and Wolfe received anonymous letters full of vilification and abuse. One threatened to kill him should he ever return. One in particular truly hurt. It was from one of his earliest mentors, Margaret Roberts, the very lady who first used the adjective genius for the then young Tom Wolfe. Writing in response to Wolfe's disparaging swipes at her husband, she penned, "You have crucified your family and devastated mine." Wolfe's sister, Mabel, later added, "The only reason we weren't tarred and feathered was because Tom didn't spare us in the book." Interestingly, both the Asheville Citizen and Asheville Times praised it. But in Raleigh, one of his Carolina friends, Jonathan Daniels, raged in the N&O. North Carolina and the South are spat upon. Like so many things in life, time would heal some of the affronts, but it would be 8 years before Thomas Wolfe visited Asheville. Despite the reviews by locals at home, he was heralded as a brilliant writer, and more works would flow from his pen. In 1935, Of Time and the River was published. And posthumously, The Web and the Rock in 1939. And for me, one of literature's saddest titles, You Can't Go Home Again, in 1940. When he did return, for the most part, many had forgiven, but regardless, he never stayed long. He still had adventures to make. Yet fate would not be kind. The disease that secretly he feared all his life cut him down. Thomas Clayton Wolfe died in the same hospital that treated his father, Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. From miliary tuberculosis of the brain, he passed September the 15th, 1938, 18 days short of his 38th birthday. The next day, the New York Times wrote, he was one of the most confident young voices in contemporary American literature. A vibrant, young, full-toned voice, which it is hard to believe could be so suddenly stilled. The stamp of genius was upon him. It was an undisciplined and unpredictable genius. There was within an unspent energy, an untiring force, an unappeasable hunger for life and for expression, which might have carried him to the heights, might equally have torn him down. In a specially ordered coffin from New York to accommodate his, by the time of his death, 6'7" frame, Wolfe was placed in the same train car that took him to and from Chapel Hill, pulled into Biltmore Station at 9:15. He was laid to rest the next day, the 18th of September. At Riverside Cemetery, this time, Thomas Wolfe finally came home, and this time for good, this time forever. Still, I cannot help but think that perhaps in many ways his happiest, most carefree, and formative days were spent right here in this town and on the campus of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It was here where a shy, reflective boy found life was to be lived like there was no tomorrow, where indeed he might just live forever. What he gained here, what he took from this place, of course, found its way into Look Homeward Angel for some 191 pages. And yet for me, there was a passage when Eugene Gant, Thomas Wolfe, was about to leave this place that creates both careers and memories. His words capture what so many have felt when it hit home, that they were about to graduate, and something in life was about to be left behind that could never again be truly lived. Yes, the memories would be dearly held, but alas, memories are just that, memories, snapshots from the past, accompanied by a wistful smile, a shake of the head, and perhaps a sigh. In that poignant passage, Wolfe captured much of what I just mentioned. He wrote, Eugene still loitered, although his baggage had been packed for days. With desperate pain, he faced departure from that Arcadian wilderness where he had known so much joy. At night, he roamed the deserted campus, talking quietly until morning with a handful of students who lingered strangely, as he did, among the ghostly buildings, among the phantoms of lost boys. He could not face a final departure. He said he would return early in autumn for a few days and at least once a year thereafter. Then one hot morning, on sudden impulse, he left. As the car that was taking him to Exeter roared down the winding street under the green leafness of June, he heard, as from the sea depth of a dream, far faint, the mellow booming of the campus bell. And suddenly, it seemed to him that all the beaten walks were thudding with footfalls of lost boys, himself among them, running for their classes. Then, as he listened, the far bell died away, and the phantom runners thudded into oblivion. Soon the car roared up by Virgil Weldon's house, and as he passed, he saw the old man sitting below his tree. Eugene stood up in the car and waved his long arm in a gesture of farewell. "Goodbye," he cried. "Goodbye." The old man stood up with a quiet salute of parting, slow, calm, eloquently tender. Then, even while Eugene stood looking back upon the street, a car roared up across the lip of the hill and drove steeply down into the hot, parched countryside below. But as the lost world faded from his sight, Eugene gave a great cry of pain and sadness, for he knew that the elfin door had closed behind him, and he would never come back again. Thomas Wolfe, I truly believe, in that passage, in that instant, captured what everyone listening right now felt when we too realized it was finally time to finish school. With graduation, we left behind sprawling, limitless youth, and armed with a degree that required thousands of answers, each one of us headed out into a world filled with thousands of questions. Yes, Thomas Wolfe left Chapel Hill behind, but he carried for the rest of his days memories made here at Carolina. Indeed, on July the 27th, 1929, he wrote to a friend and fellow classmate, "So far from forgetting the blessed place, I think my picture of it grows clearer every year. It was as close to magic as I've ever been." For those of us who went here, and perhaps are still here, how blessed we are to continue to revel in the hypnotic spell this university and this town still weaves. And the doors are always open. And unlike what Thomas Wolfe would later write, yes, you can come home again. Thank you, Douglas. Thank you, Grant. This is Freddie Kiger. Thank you for joining us, and hope you are well and continue to be well.